October 1937, Shanghai, China. The city was a sprawling, cosmopolitan metropolis, a vibrant hub of international trade and culture, often called the Paris of the East. But by the autumn of 1937, it had transformed into something unrecognizable, the epicenter of one of the largest and bloodiest urban battles the world had yet seen. 3 months earlier, an accidental clash between Chinese and Japanese troops near the Marco Polo Bridge outside Beijing had escalated, providing the pretext for Japan to launch a full-scale invasion of China. The Second Sino Japanese War had begun, a conflict that would eventually merge into the global cataclysm of World War II. Japan expected a swift victory. Their modernized, well-equipped imperial army had easily overrun Manchuria years earlier. They anticipated that China, plagued by internal divisions and lacking a modern military-industrial complex, would collapse within weeks. Shanghai was supposed to be the decisive blow. Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of nationalist China, knew he could not defeat the Japanese imperial army in a conventional, decisive battle. But he also knew that allowing Shanghai, China's most important international city, to fall without a fight would be a catastrophic blow to national morale and international prestige. He made a fateful decision: to turn Shanghai into a symbol of Chinese resistance, to fight for every street and every building, no matter the cost. He would force the Japanese into a bloody, attritional battle under the watchful eyes of the Western powers residing in the city's international settlement and French concession. He would demonstrate to the world that China would not surrender. For this stand, Chiang committed his best troops, the elite, German-trained divisions of the National Revolutionary Army, NRA. These were the divisions that represented the modernization of the Chinese military, equipped with German Mauser rifles, steel helmets, and, crucially, trained in German tactical doctrine by advisors like Alexander von Falkenhausen. They were the pride of the NRA, intended to be the core of a future modern army. Chiang was gambling his best assets on a single, desperate defense. The Battle of Shanghai began in August and quickly devolved into a brutal meat grinder. The Japanese, expecting a quick victory, found themselves bogged down in ferocious street fighting against an enemy who contested every inch of ground. The Chinese soldiers, despite lacking heavy artillery, air support, and adequate medical care, fought with a suicidal bravery that stunned the Japanese commanders. Entire battalions were wiped out defending single strongpoints. Soldiers would strap explosives to their bodies and throw themselves under Japanese tanks. The fighting was savage, often degenerating into hand-to-hand combat amidst the ruins. By October, however, the sheer weight of Japanese industrial power began to tell. The Imperial Japanese Army, under General Iwane Matsui, had landed significant reinforcements north and south of the city, threatening to encircle the Chinese defenders. They possessed overwhelming superiority in artillery, armor, and, most critically, air power. Japanese bombers systematically reduced Chinese positions to rubble, while Chinese troops had little defense against the constant aerial attacks. The main Japanese force pushing into the northern districts of Shanghai was facing particularly stiff resistance around a series of small, interconnected villages and creek lines that the Chinese had turned into fortified positions. One such strong point, located near the village of Miaohang, centered around a creek crossing known as Shangshuiku, which translates roughly to fragrant water inlet. This area had become a critical anchor in the Chinese defensive line. It was not a grand fortress, but a typical landscape of rural Shanghai. Small brick houses, cemeteries, scattered trees, and narrow, winding waterways, all transformed into a deadly maze of machine gun nests, trench lines, and barbed wire. The Japanese 3rd Division, veterans hardened by previous campaigns, held this sector. They had established formidable defenses, digging deep trenches, reinforcing buildings with sandbags, and creating interlocking fields of fire with their Type 92 heavy machine guns. Their positions were supported by regimental infantry guns and mortars, and they could call upon overwhelming divisional and corps artillery fire at a moment's notice. Critically, they also enjoyed complete air supremacy, with Mitsubishi Ki-10 biplane fighters and Ki-21 heavy bombers operating from nearby captured airfields. Despite the deteriorating strategic situation, with Japanese landings threatening encirclement, the Chinese command in Shanghai clung to the hope of a local breakthrough. They believed that a successful counterattack, even a limited one, could disrupt the Japanese advance, boost the flagging morale of their troops, and perhaps buy more time for international intervention. The target selected for this desperate gamble was the Japanese salient around Changshuiku. The plan was audacious, bordering on suicidal. Several of the best remaining Chinese divisions, including elements of the highly regarded 88th Division, one of the original German-trained units that had borne the brunt of the fighting since August, were tasked with launching a frontal assault to recapture Changshuiku and push the Japanese back across the Yunzaoben Creek. It was a plan born of desperation, a demand for offensive action in a situation that screamed for a strategic withdrawal. But the political and psychological stakes were immense. Retreat was unthinkable. The Chinese soldiers assembled for the attack were a study in contrasts. Many were veterans of the brutal fighting in Jabei and other districts, their German-style uniforms tattered, their faces gaunt with exhaustion and malnutrition, but their eyes still holding a burning resolve. They were armed primarily with the Chiang Kai-shek rifle, a domestic copy of the Mauser standard model, or the older Hanyang 88 rifle. Their section support weapon was the Czech-designed ZB Vrzender 26 light machine gun, a reliable and effective weapon, but available only in limited numbers. Heavy machine guns were scarce, and mortars even scarcer. Critically, they possessed almost no effective anti-tank weapons beyond bundles of stick grenades, the infamous potato mashers. Their artillery support was minimal, consisting of a few batteries of light 75mm field guns, often positioned too far back and lacking sufficient ammunition and accurate targeting information. They were being asked to attack a modern, fortified position with essentially the tools of an infantry army from the previous World War. Facing them were Japanese soldiers who represented the pinnacle of Asia's most industrialized nation. The average Japanese infantryman was superbly trained, indoctrinated with the Bushido code of death before dishonor, and equipped with excellent weapons. The standard Arisaka Type 38 rifle was accurate and reliable. Their Type 92 heavy machine guns, while cumbersome, laid down a devastating field of fire. Their Type 89 grenade dischargers, nicknamed knee mortars, provided infantry squads with their own portable artillery, capable of dropping small, high-explosive shells with surprising accuracy. They were supported by Type 95 Heigo light tanks, which, while vulnerable, were terrifying weapons against infantry lacking dedicated anti-tank guns. Most importantly, the Japanese soldier operated within a system that provided him with overwhelming fire support. Japanese artillery observers could call down accurate barrages within minutes, and Japanese aircraft circled overhead, ready to bomb and strafe any sign of a Chinese advance. The area around Changshuiku was flat, open terrain, broken only by scattered buildings, burial mounds, and the ubiquitous network of creeks and canals. It was perfect defensive ground, offering long fields of fire. The Japanese had expertly integrated their positions into this landscape. Machine guns were sited in the upper floors of brick houses, providing plunging fire. Trenches followed the contours of the creek banks. Barbed wire, often salvaged from civilian properties, was strung thickly across all likely avenues of approach. It was a fortress built not of concrete, but of earth, brick, wire, and perfectly sighted machine guns. Into this killing field, the Chinese soldiers were ordered to advance. The attack was scheduled for the pre-dawn hours of October 21, 1937. Thousands of Chinese soldiers moved silently into their jump-off positions, often just a few hundred yards from the Japanese lines. The air was thick with tension. Every man knew the odds. They had seen what Japanese machine guns and artillery could do. Yet, they prepared to obey. Their motivation was a potent mixture of patriotism, hatred for the invader, and a grim acceptance of their likely fate. The Chinese artillery preparation, when it came, was pitifully inadequate. A few dozen shells whistled overhead and exploded somewhere near the Japanese lines, doing little more than announcing the imminent attack and ensuring every Japanese machine gunner was alert and ready. Then the whistles blew. From shallow ditches and shell craters, thousands of Chinese soldiers rose as one and began their charge across the open ground towards Xiangshuiku. They advanced in dense waves, officers leading from the front, shouting patriotic slogans. It was a spectacle of raw, naked courage, a human tide surging forward into a storm of steel. The Japanese response was immediate and overwhelming. Searchlights snapped on, bathing the battlefield in an eerie white glare. Flares popped overhead, illuminating the advancing lines. And then every machine gun, rifle, mortar, and artillery piece in the sector opened fire simultaneously. The sound was not a series of distinct shots, but a single, continuous, deafening roar, a mechanical hurricane of death that swept across the field. The first waves of Chinese infantry simply disintegrated. Men were scythed down in their hundreds, falling in tangled heaps before they had covered half the distance to the Japanese lines. The air was filled with the screams of the wounded and the relentless, hammering rhythm of the machine guns. Despite the apocalyptic wall of fire erupting from the Japanese lines, the Chinese attack did not falter. It simply continued, wave after wave of men rising from the earth and running forward into the maelstrom. This was not the disciplined, coordinated assault Brusilov had orchestrated. This was a display of raw, almost incomprehensible courage, fueled by desperation and a willingness to die for inches of ground. The sheer density of the Japanese fire was unlike anything most of these soldiers had ever experienced. The Type 92 heavy machine guns, firing in interlocking patterns from sandbagged emplacements, created a literal curtain of lead across the battlefield. These weapons, fed by 30-round stripper clips, could sustain a high rate of fire, and the Japanese gunners were masters of their craft, traversing methodically back and forth, cutting down the charging lines like wheat before a scythe. Adding to this were hundreds, perhaps thousands, of individual Japanese riflemen firing their accurate Arisaka rifles from the relative safety of their trenches. The real killers, however, were the mortars and artillery. The Japanese Type 89 grenade dischargers, the knee mortars, were particularly devastating. Each Japanese infantry squad possessed one, allowing them to drop 50-millimeter high explosive shells with unnerving accuracy directly into the advancing Chinese ranks or into any depression where soldiers tried to take cover. These small explosions, while not powerful enough to destroy fortifications, were brutally effective against exposed infantry, tearing through flesh and shattering morale. Farther back, batteries of Japanese Type 92 70mm infantry guns and Type 41 75mm mountain guns added their weight to the barrage. Firing high explosive and shrapnel shells, they blanketed the approaches to Xiangshuiku, their fire directed by forward observers who had a clear view of the unfolding slaughter. The coordination between the Japanese infantry, mortars, and artillery was seamless, a testament to their professional training and doctrine. Any Chinese unit that momentarily survived the machine guns would quickly find itself bracketed by mortar rounds or obliterated by an artillery salvo. Yet, incredibly, some Chinese soldiers made it through. Using the scant cover offered by burial mounds, shell craters, or the bodies of their fallen comrades, small groups managed to reach the Japanese barbed wire. Here, they faced their next ordeal. The wire, thick and rusty, was often strung in multiple belts, sometimes concealed in shallow ditches. Reaching it meant exposing themselves to point-blank machine gun fire. Cutting it with hand tools under such conditions was almost impossible. Many soldiers died tangled in the wire, their bodies adding to the gruesome obstacle. Some carried crude Bangalore torpedoes, long pipes filled with explosives, attempting to blast a path. Others simply threw themselves onto the wire, creating a human bridge for their comrades to cross. This act of ultimate self-sacrifice was repeated countless times, a horrifying testament to the soldiers' determination. Where small breaches were made, handfuls of Chinese soldiers, often led by junior officers wielding Mauser C-96 broom-handle pistols, would pour through, only to find themselves in the labyrinth of Japanese trenches. Here, the fighting devolved into a chaotic, primitive brawl. Bayonets, trench knives, shovels, and fists became the weapons of choice. The Japanese soldiers, though surprised by the attackers reaching their lines, fought with equal ferocity. They were masters of close-quarters combat, and their Nambu pistols and Type 94 pistols spat fire in the confines of the trenches. Grenades exploded constantly, the concussive blasts echoing off the earthen walls. For brief, desperate moments, sections of the Japanese front line were overrun. Chinese soldiers would gain a foothold, only to be hit by immediate vicious counterattacks from Japanese reserve platoons who emerged from deep dugouts, their bayonets fixed. These localized struggles were incredibly bloody, often ending only when every man on one side or the other was dead. Overseeing this inferno was the ever-present threat from the air. As dawn broke, Japanese aircraft appeared overhead. Mitsubishi Ki-10 biplane fighters circled the battlefield like vultures, strafing any concentration of Chinese troops they could see with impunity. The Chinese soldiers had virtually no anti-aircraft weapons beyond rifles and light machine guns pointed skyward in futile defiance. The fighters could operate at treetop level, their machine guns ripping through the exposed infantry. Worse still were the Mitsubishi Ki-21 Sally heavy bombers. Flying in small formations, they dropped fragmentation bombs and high explosives onto the Chinese rear areas, disrupting the flow of reinforcements and supplies, and adding another layer of terror to the battlefield. For the Chinese soldiers pinned down in the open, the sight and sound of the approaching Japanese aircraft was often the final psychological blow. There was nowhere to hide, no way to fight back. They could only endure the rain of bombs and bullets from the sky. Despite the horrific losses and the seemingly impossible odds, the Chinese command persisted in the attack throughout the day. Fresh battalions were thrown into the fight, ordered to push forward over the bodies of those who had fallen before them. The sheer resilience of the Chinese soldier was astonishing. Men who had seen their entire platoons wiped out would regroup with survivors from other units and prepare for the next assault. Junior officers and NCOs took command when their superiors fell, urging their men forward with shouts and gestures. They displayed a fatalistic courage, an understanding that their individual lives were insignificant compared to the larger struggle for national survival. They were fighting not just for Changshuiku, but for the soul of China. Their bravery was undeniable, but it was being expended at a terrifying rate. The fields in front of the Japanese lines were becoming a vast open grave, littered with thousands of Chinese dead and wounded. The Japanese defenders, while holding their ground, were also paying a price. The sheer fanatical determination of the Chinese assaults was unlike anything they had faced before. Their ammunition was being consumed at a prodigious rate. Their machine gun barrels glowed red hot and required constant changing. Their soldiers were exhausted, nerves frayed by the continuous waves of attackers and the constant proximity of death. While their defenses held, the experience was deeply unsettling. They were killing hundreds, thousands, yet the enemy kept coming. This was not the swift, clean victory their commanders had promised. This was a brutal, grinding extermination, and the enemy seemed willing to pay any price. Captured Chinese soldiers often displayed a stoic indifference to their fate, further unnerving their captors. The Japanese began to realize they were not fighting a disorganized rabble. They were fighting an entire nation that had decided to resist, no matter the cost. One particularly brutal aspect of the fighting centered around the small brick houses and farm buildings that dotted the landscape. The Japanese had turned these into miniature fortresses, knocking out firing slits, reinforcing walls, and digging communication trenches between them. Chinese assault teams, often armed only with rifles and grenades, would attempt to storm these strong points. The fighting would spill into the narrow alleyways and courtyards, a desperate close-quarters struggle where every doorway and window could conceal a machine gun. The Chinese developed crude but effective tactics. Some soldiers would provide covering fire while others crawled forward with bundles of grenades, attempting to toss them through windows or onto roofs. Sometimes, a single brave soldier, a dadao, or big sword specialist, armed with a traditional Chinese long-handled sword, would charge a machine gun nest in a suicidal attempt to silence it. These individual acts of heroism, while often futile, were testament to the spirit driving the attack. By the evening of October 21st, the Chinese attack had clearly failed to achieve its objective. They had not broken the Japanese line. They had not recaptured Xiangshuiku. They had suffered catastrophic casualties, losing thousands of men, including many irreplaceable veterans from the elite German trained divisions. Any rational military assessment would have called for an immediate halt to the offensive and a withdrawal to consolidate what little remained. But the logic of the Battle of Shanghai was no longer purely military. It was political and psychological. Chiang Kai-shek, observing the battle from afar, needed a victory, or at least the appearance of continued resistance, to maintain international support and domestic morale. The local commanders, perhaps trapped by their own rhetoric of defiance, ordered the attacks to continue. The second day of the assault, October 22nd, was largely a repetition of the first, only perhaps even more tragic. The element of surprise was gone. The Japanese were fully alert, their defenses repaired and reinforced, their artillery perfectly registered on every likely approach route. The Chinese soldiers were even more exhausted, their ranks thinner, their ammunition scarcer. Yet, they attacked again. Once more, the whistles blew, and the depleted battalions rose and charged into the same sheets of machine gun fire, the same storms of artillery and mortar shells. The results were predictably horrific. Small gains made in desperate night infiltrations were quickly wiped out by savage Japanese counterattacks supported by tanks. The casualty rate climbed even higher. Medics struggled to evacuate the wounded under the constant fire, and thousands of injured men bled to death in the muddy fields between the lines. The entire operation had descended into a senseless, self-destructive sacrifice. It was no longer a battle, it was martyrdom on an industrial scale. By October 23rd, even the most determined Chinese commanders had to face the grim reality. The counterattack at Xiangshuiku was not just failing, it was actively destroying the remaining combat effectiveness of their best divisions. The fields before the Japanese lines were a horror show, a landscape sculpted by high explosives and littered with thousands upon thousands of Chinese dead. The wounded who could not be retrieved lay crying out in agony until they were silenced by Japanese snipers or succumbed to their injuries. The stench of death hung heavy in the humid air, a miasma that permeated everything. The attack was finally called off, not because the objective was deemed unattainable, but because there were simply not enough men left capable of forming another assault wave. The units that had been thrown into the meat grinder were shattered, reduced to mere fractions of their original strength. Companies were commanded by corporals, battalions by lieutenants. The elite 88th Division, which had begun the Battle of Shanghai as a symbol of China's modernizing army, had been effectively annihilated in the fighting around Xiangshuiku and previous engagements. The Japanese, while victorious in holding their ground, were deeply shaken by the experience. They had witnessed a level of human sacrifice that even their own Bushido-infused doctrine found difficult to comprehend. Reports sent back to Tokyo spoke of the fanatical and suicidal nature of the Chinese resistance. While Japanese propaganda portrayed the Chinese soldier as weak and cowardly, the soldiers on the front lines knew the truth. They had faced men who were willing to charge machine guns armed only with grenades, men who would fight to the death in ruined buildings rather than surrender. This realization, repeated in countless brutal encounters across the Shanghai battlefield, began to erode the Japanese belief in a quick, easy victory in China. They were winning the battles, but the cost was far higher than anticipated, and the enemy's will to resist seemed limitless. The fighting at Xiangshuiku was a microcosm of this grim reality. The immediate aftermath of the failed counterattack was catastrophic for the Chinese strategic position in Shanghai. The divisions sacrificed at Xiangshuiku were desperately needed to hold other sectors of the collapsing front. Their destruction created gaps that the Japanese quickly exploited. Just days later, on November 5th, the Japanese executed a brilliant and daring amphibious landing far to the south at Hangzhou Bay. This landing completely outflanked the entire Chinese defensive line around Shanghai. Faced with encirclement, Chiang Kai-shek was finally forced to order a general retreat. What followed was a chaotic and disastrous withdrawal. The Chinese armies, exhausted and disorganized after 3 months of brutal fighting, lacked the transport and coordination to conduct an orderly retreat. They were harried by Japanese aircraft and pursued by fast-moving Japanese columns. Tens of thousands of Chinese soldiers were cut off and captured or killed during the withdrawal. The heroic stand at Shanghai, symbolized by the doomed sacrifice at Xiangshuiku, ended not with a bang, but with a chaotic and tragic collapse. The Battle of Shanghai, and within it the fight for Xiangshuiku, was a defining moment in the Second Sino Japanese War. Tactically, it was a clear Japanese victory. They captured the city and inflicted devastating casualties on the best units of the Chinese army. However, strategically, the battle was a Pyrrhic victory for Japan and a strategic success for China. Chiang Kai-shek had achieved his primary objective. By holding Shanghai for 3 long months against the full might of the Japanese military, he had shattered Japan's dream of a quick conquest. He had shown the world, particularly the Western powers who observed the battle from the safety of the international settlement, that China would fight. This international attention was crucial. The graphic news reports and photographs of the fighting, particularly the horrific bombing of civilian areas, generated widespread sympathy for China and began to turn international opinion against Japan's aggression. The stand at Shanghai bought China precious time to move industries inland, time to mobilize its vast reserves of manpower, and time to appeal for international aid. The Battle of Xiangshuiku itself stands as a testament to the extraordinary courage of the Chinese soldier in the face of impossible odds. The decision to launch a frontal assault against a heavily fortified position with inadequate support was undoubtedly a tactical blunder, a tragic waste of life born from desperation. But the men who carried out those orders displayed a level of bravery and self-sacrifice that defies easy description. They knew they were charging into almost certain death. They knew their chances of reaching the enemy lines, let alone surviving, were minimal. Yet they went forward anyway, driven by a fierce patriotism and a refusal to yield their country to the invader. Their sacrifice, while tactically futile, contributed to the larger strategic narrative of Chinese defiance. They demonstrated to the Japanese and to the world that conquering China would not be easy, that every inch of ground would be paid for in blood. The legacy of the battle is a somber one. Xiangshuiku does not feature prominently in many Western histories of World War II, overshadowed by the later, larger battles of the Pacific War. Even within China, the memory of the sacrifices made by the nationalist soldiers during the early years of the war was often suppressed or downplayed after the Communist Revolution. Yet the Battle of Shanghai and the countless acts of heroism within it, like the doomed attack at Xiangshuiku, were crucial. They were the crucible in which modern China's spirit of resistance was forged. The soldiers who died in the muddy fields near Fragrant Water Inlet did not die in vain. They bought their country the time it needed to survive, to endure 8 long years of brutal war, and to ultimately emerge victorious as one of the Allied powers. Their story is a reminder that courage is not always measured in victory, but sometimes in the willingness to fight on when defeat seems certain. China challenged Japan's army in a doomed attack, and what happened was a tragedy, a slaughter, but also an unforgettable display of the human spirit's refusal to be broken.